latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, we are delighted to introduce Shu Yap. Shu is an esteemed astrologer, writer, and lecturer with a career spanning over 20 years. So thank you so much, Shu, for joining us today. How are you doing this morning in Australia?
I'm going really well, thank you, Callum. It's lovely to be here, and I'm excited to get into the teaching season.
Wonderful, wonderful, fantastic. Well, that takes me on to my first question. So on June 11th, you'll be teaching a free webinar, which is titled Planetary Cycles. So for anyone who would want to join that webinar, can you just speak to the details of what's happening that day?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to be presenting that webinar on a topic that's really close to my heart, and that's basically understanding the life journey of an entire planet. And so that if we understand the context of where that planet has come from and where it's going, it can really inform the way we delineate that planet into whether it is we're looking at natal charts or whether we're looking at a solar return chart or a transit. I just feel it gives so much more depth and nuance to just looking at a, say, Mars transit, as opposed to Mars moving into a retrograde phase, and what does that mean? What sort of Mars is that compared to a Mars that's about to set as the evening starts? So I'll be going into all the juicy details around the planet's life.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that's a real deep dive then. We're talking about planetary, the life cycles of the actual planets as opposed, because you'll be talking about transits, but essentially the cycles of the planets themselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, I want to be able to just get across, things like how old is that planet in its synodic cycle. So we're essentially looking at synodic cycles, a planet's relationship with the sun. So they all take varying times. But, I want to be able to instill like a sense of how old is that planet? What stage of evolution is that planet on its, natural journey? And how does that inform the way we then translate it into situations in the ephemeral experiences. So yeah, that's what I'll be presenting on.
That's such a fascinating topic, and I'll be hosting with you as well that day, so that's going to be fantastic. So for anyone out there who might not know what synodic cycles are, can you give more description to that?
Sure. A synodic cycle, synodic solar phase cycle, I must clarify, because a synodic cycle is essentially a relationship between two or more planets together when they start at one phase and then go through all the different phases and come back to its original phase. But we'll be looking at the synodic solar phase cycle of all the planets except for the moon, because that has a slightly different relationship. And so it's essentially each planet's relationship with the sun. So, for example, let's take Mars for an example. If Mars and the sun are making a conjunction, that's the beginning of its synodic solar phase cycle. And then it will go through all the different aspects, and Mars going forwards and backwards as well, until it comes back together with the sun. And that will be one whole entire solar phase cycle of Mars. And so we'll be going through two different types of solar phase cycles. So there's two, I call them, templates, for want of a better word. There's the template of the superior planets, all the planets that are above the sun. So that's Jupiter, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And then there's another template for the inferior planets, which is Venus and Mercury. So the inferior template is a little bit more complex because Venus and Mercury don't ever go more than 2 signs away from the sun. So there's a slightly different pattern and template of the movement of those planets compared to the superior planets, which is more straightforward. So, and with each two templates, they have slightly different phases that I want to talk about. So, for example, with Mercury and Venus, they have their maximum elongations, which is a significant part of their phase. Compared to, say, the superior planets that go through a chronicle phase and the curtailed passage, where they're in opposition to the sun, but so technically you should be able to see them, but for that moment at sunset, you can't see that planet because of the glare on both sides. So, these tiny little nerdy details that I want to discuss, because all of this can be translated into symbolic language. And I guess this is what really interests me about studying phases, because like most people, we started, a lot of older astrologers started in the modern world. And it wasn't until I got into these old translations that I read a lot of passages around, things like orientations and rise and sets and all this kind of language. And it was all quite new to me at that stage. And I realized that there was this whole other language available to us that that wasn't prior, when we were just looking at signs and houses and planets and signs and houses. So it wasn't until I really got into these phases that astrology really became alive to me. It was really the thing that connected me from the earth to the sky, and translating things in more of an ephemeral or animistic manner. So there's something really magical to this whole aspect of looking at the chart.
That's so wonderful, and I'm so excited to be joining with you on this webinar. And for people out there, what is the difference between superior, inferior, in some of the terminologies, if you don't mind explaining?
Sure. The superior planets are the planets above the sun that move slower than the sun in that Chaldean order. So it's Mars, Saturn, and Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the inferiors are the planets below the sun, Mercury and Venus. And yes, we will just be focusing on those 5 planets. We won't be looking at the modern planets, and because I just haven't done as much research into them based on this context. And the moon operates slightly in different ways. Yeah. So that's almost like a whole other workshop in itself.
The moon needs its own thing, you could 2 or 3 hours on that one.
Totally, yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. So you're going to be talking about transit, solar returns, secondary progressions, is that right? Or progressions and different and chart examples in that webinar?
Yeah, so I'll first go through the theory and the astronomy and the interpretive principles, and then we'll discover that we can actually apply these interpretive principles onto any kind of chart. And it's one thing I like to do, even if I wanted to glance at a solar return chart, just to glance the year ahead. You can really use that solar return chart to pull out the key omens for the year by using this technique. And this is something that it's reading the chart in a slightly different way, but I think it will be really illuminating for students who haven't kind of gone into this top material that deeply, to be able to access a new way of looking at the chart, and to be able to glean the chart and pull out some key themes that are very fundamental for that chart, whether it's a predictive chart or a natal chart. And by looking at secondary progressions, this is where we can actually track the forward movement of that planet. So we're going to be looking at Elon Musk's chart, actually, as one of our key examples. And he has a really interesting chart with lots of significant phases that we're about to drop. And so when things happen shortly after the birth, say 10 days after the birth, you can track by secondary progressions when that's going to be. And sure enough, you'll notice that theme coming through very strongly in the life at around the 10-year-old phase. So we will cover as much as we can of that in that short amount of time. I feel it's just an introduction and so much more to explore and research together after that.
Wow, that sounds so fascinating. So is this, would you say, open to beginners, intermediates, what kind of levels, or is it open to everyone, do you feel, with the material?
Yeah, okay. I think it's probably better if you have some foundational astrology. However, I think beginners can still watch this lecture and I guess get a feel for a more complex understanding of planetary interpretation. Yes, they might get lost in some of the languaging, perhaps, which I'm going to try and be as talk in English as much as possible. But there's, all these sorts of little
technical terms
like,
and
yeah, exactly, like rise and sets and, you know, a chronicle phase, curtail passage, you know, gazemes, that kind of thing. But, you know, all of this will become part of your vernacular anyway. And I really do feel we're moving into more of this type of chart reading as astrology develops. Like one example is that, you know, I use Solar Fire as my main program. And Solar Fire, besides, you know, the stations and, you know, going retrograde direct, you know, there's not really much automated, well, to what I'm aware of, there's not much automated data that you can spit out to tell you rise and set times or, well, I'm not aware of that anyway, and I'm a bit of a Luddite, so that might not mean anything. So I think that's also a bit of a reflection of where the astrology is at. You know, when you can see it reflected in the software, it means that it must be gaining that level of popularity for it to actually be involved in the software. And I know, I think Adam Gainsbourg has a software for Venus, I believe, that will show these phases. But other than having to sift through an ephemeris, it's actually quite difficult. So I'm hoping to be able to compile some kind of a little ephemeris for the current cycles that we're at that I can offer to the students, just so that it makes it easier for them to at least use to study the current cycle that they're in, which won't end for another probably a couple of years' time. So, so I'm hoping I'll have time to compile that before our discussion.
Wonderful. And it sounds like you're tying in the astronomy with the astrology, because, I mean, we often forget that, or people will forget that astrology is alive. You know, we've got living, you know, bodies moving around and with the orbit. So you're looking at the, you know, the rise and the setting, the physical motions of the planets, these cycles that we're going through. Because often, obviously we see, you know, natal charts or different charts, and it's static. You know, we're not seeing the planets moving around. So it's almost a sense like you're bringing life to some of these techniques and interpretations.
Yes, totally. I think from understanding this theory, you should be able to go outside and start tracking the planets, you know, and realize that why is it that when planets are retrograde, they're so bright in the sky, you know, because they, like when I'm going to attempt doing a live kind of moving of like balls or crystals or whatever to try and demonstrate that. I'm going to attempt it. I'm not going to show how well that's going to go. I've got a few rehearsals that
I love that.
We'll realize why it is that we can see like planets that are retrograde so brightly in the sky, because you'll see how close they become. They become the closest distance to Earth, for example. So, and I do encourage people to even, you know, get 3 different stones or, you know, things that they can play along with actually moving the planets around as they orbit around the Earth, which is because it's the Earth's perspective. Everything is actually moving around the Earth. We're not actually moving around the sun. So so it's going to be it's going to be fun. It's going to be hopefully taken to another world in some regards, and hopefully this connects people to the sky a bit more, and they can head out and see when planets are rising and setting, or when they're about to move retrograde and then go the other way.
That's so wonderful. And by then, I think Mercury will be going direct. Although, have we got Saturn going retrograde next week? I think we do, don't we?
Yes, that's right. So
and a
few obstacles to have to go through.
Absolutely. Well, that's such a wonderful description. And again, for everyone watching, just to reiterate, it'll be June 11th. And I think that's from 3 till 5 p.m. Pacific time. So if we have any viewers in Australia and places like that, I can't do it off the top of my head.
Yes, so if anyone in Australia on the eastern seaboard will be 8 o'clock in the morning, I think, on Sunday. Okay. So, but I think the recording will be available for a week. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So anything that we post, you know, webinars wise, will be always available to view after. So if any of you can't attend live, you can watch the recordings as well. And I think we're going to put a link. We're going to put the link to the description, the registration below this video, and I'm going to put some pop-ups, and either here or here, you'll find out.
Great.
Which is fantastic. And actually comes to another point, because you'll also be teaching a 5-week course in July, the 23rd, and this is going to be dealing primarily just with solar returns. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I'll be teaching a 5-week solar returns course, and I'm going to put this webinar into one of the references because it's going to be too hard for me to go through all of this within that course without it taking up too much time. So people will be able to refer back to this as a reference to be able to then help them interpret the solar returns class, the solar returns chart. So yeah.
Wonderful. I'm so excited for that. Solar returns are some of my favorites. Throwing in with the perfections and your Lord of the Years and transits and whatnot, and then get these new techniques as well. I'm so excited for that. So
yes.
Yeah. So we'll put the link to that in the description as well. And again, we'd love to actually have you back on the show. Maybe we can go into more depth of that particular 5-week course, because it's more comprehensive, isn't it, over 5 weeks, and maybe we can look at a few charts and whatnot from there.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
So for anyone who can find you, do you have a website that people can go to, and any of your work that you have done previously?
Sure, yeah. The best way is to probably sign up to my email list, because I'm very temperamental on social media. Like sometimes I go hell for leather and other times I'm not even present at all. So intercycle.com, it's interpsycle.com, and there should be a pop-up, or you can sign up to my newsletter, and that will keep you. I have a weekly newsletter that I send out with the week's transits, and that's where I kind of put all of my teaching schedule up week by week as well. So if you're interested, just sign up and we'll keep in touch that way.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, we'll have the links and registrations below this video, and as everyone is watching. So we appreciate it so much for us joining today. And yeah, you're a day ahead. You're in the morning right now.
Yes, I know. It's hard as astrologers, because when we write our, weekly, monthly, whatever transit reports, sometimes I have no idea what time zone I'm in. I could be 6 weeks ahead.
Yeah. Sometimes I don't know what day it is.
I know.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we'll get to speak with you again shortly. And I very much look forward to this webinar, and again, the 5-week course, which will be happening in July. So again, thank you so much, Shu, for joining us today, and thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. I hope to see you all there.